So welcome everyone to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm joined by my good friend, Jordan Hall. And so I've proposed a topic. We're doing this trilogy on the sacred. We did a first one on the sacred per se, and then we did a second one on connections between grief, loss, suffering, and the sacred. And now there's a topic I'm proposing to Jordan, and he's already accepted to discuss this, which is I want to propose that the West has not properly grieved the death of God, to put it in a Nietzschean framework with a Jungian twist. And the idea is you can see a lot of the meaning crisis as symptomatic of how people behave when they're stuck in unprocessed grief. They look for surrogacies. They act out behavior of sort of anger, and they do sort of ineffective search strategies. They get stuck. They can't move on to a new relationship. They keep trying to recover, and so they get, well, and this is how it's often put. People get stuck in unprocessed grief. They get traumatized by it, and I myself have experienced that. I grew up in a very fundamentalist version of Christianity, and then leaving that, I was traumatized within it. I didn't realize the trauma until afterwards. And then I realized that a lot of my behavior has been, in a sense, grieving that God and trying to grow beyond that grief, like we talked about last time, and open myself up to new possibilities of relationship. So that's the topic. I hope it's sort of said well, and now I'd like to hear what you have to say, Jordan, in response to that.
Yeah. So when you proposed it, we began to riff on it, and so to say surrogates, for example.
Yeah.
Here, it's funny. I'm actually listening to one of your first few meaning crisis videos on YouTube.
Right.
I first actually sort of saw your face and heard your voice,
yeah.
And the framing of ideology as a surrogate, right? You have a God-shaped hole in your life, and one of the things that you might do is you might try to suture that hole with an ideology that provides the answers. Or you might go the other direction. You might become an atheist, which is you deny that it ever mattered at all, right? It wasn't it was never really an important thing, and so its absence has no value.
Right.
And fill in the blank. So I actually think that's a very beautiful frame to say that the grief, we have not actually processed the grief of the death of God, and that explains a very large fraction, perhaps all, but a very large fraction of the various coping mechanisms that have been in place. And what's nice is it also activates like the meaningfulness of grief. What is the meaningfulness of grief? What is it about? What is it? How is it in service? And the idea is to say that there's something about the nature of allowing grief, to really allow grief. Like you might even say that grief is this is nice. Yeah, try this. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you go up and down in an elevator.
Right.
Yeah. And the sensation of going down, there's a feeling in your stomach, which is in fact physically, literally, your stomach is not going down as fast as your feet, right? It's a little bit detached. You're going up, there's a feeling in your stomach, right?
Yeah.
And it's something like, without attaching any particular kind of preference to it, grief is the sensation that is associated with healing in a particular way. And so when you have a lot of healing to do, the energy of that as you're going through the process of that, it's the feeling of that experience. And so if you block the grief, it's literally like holding back the healing energy. Grief it feels uncomfortable. It feels, in fact, it's not even painful. It has a feeling of its own, but it's very uncomfortable. And so in many cases we block it. We don't want to have that feeling go through us. But if the hypothesis is that's like, it's just a particular quality of feeling that is associated with a particular aspect of experience, which in this case, for the moment at least, I'm just going to name healing.
Right.
There may be more to it, maybe healing and growing.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
You're not that different from like a sore muscle.
Right. Right.
I
Right.
exercise and I have a sore muscle, and there's something about the feeling of the processing of the soreness of the muscle that's associated with the healing of the micro tears that happen in the muscle from exercising it, and
Right.
the growth of stronger muscles that happen in exercise. So if you kind of frame it in that way, say,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, well, that's really interesting." That there's the grief is that the 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 quality of feeling associated with the processing of and thereby healing and growing as a consequence of some kind of, in this case, some kind of loss or some kind of
Mm. Right.
change.
Right. Right.
Something goes away. A change occurs, and in that change, some aspect of reality is no longer, and the aspect of reality that is continues is undergoes grief as it begins the process of growing into the new possibilities and healing the things that have broken as a consequence of the change.
Right. Right.
um and the death of God would be a pretty big change.
Well, I mean, the famous passage with the madman in the marketplace, Nietzsche said, and of course, like everything that Nietzsche said, it's multivocal and trying to assign it a single interpretation. It goes beyond the intent of Nietzsche. But he said, we're not worthy of the event. He makes it stronger. He said, it's not only that God has died, but we've killed him and we're not worthy of the event yet. And so, and people forget that when Nietzsche pronounces the death of God and says that, he's not talking to the believers. He's talking to a group of atheists in the marketplace. Um, so part of what I wanted to do by bringing that up is to try and separate what you've introduced, the healing, and what we talked about last time about how grief takes you to the depths so that you can see into the depths of other people. Those holes of loss are apertures through which we can see beyond the prison wall of the ego. All of that we talked about last time, and you've said like it's healing and growing, and I want to separate it from what the temptation is here, which is to make this an issue about the debate, about the arguments about the existence of God, because it's clear that Nietzsche's madman, and of course he's crazy wisdom madman, um, is not interested in that, because he directs what he's saying to the atheists. He's saying, even if what you say is true, you have not, well, you have not properly grieved the event. And he says we have to grow much larger in order to be worthy of the event. And so whether, and again, I'm putting aside the metaphysical question. I identify as a non-theist, because I think the theism atheism debate misframes the question of the sacred, and perhaps we can get back to that in a fundamental way. But what the criticism I'm making, independent of this metaphysical argument, which I think is a misframed argument anyways, is that the new atheist movement doesn't give us the tools for grieving the death of God, other than ideological tools of trying to convince us that we're stupid to believe in a particular proposition. And so, in a very real way, because I meet lots of people, as you can imagine, through my channel and stuff, and they've gone through that sort of the new atheist, and then they come and they say, but I wasn't satisfied, right? Like it didn't, right? What negating a proposition is radically insufficient for grieving. And so the critique I'm making, the cultural critique, is the people, and the people on the other side, the theists, especially more literalist fundamentalist ilk, they're no better. They're like the people that when you've lost a loved one and they sit down beside you and say, "Don't worry, there's another one just around the corner." That sort of like relentless optimism that we've talked about, this, right, which is not being present with someone's grief; it's actually denying it. And then the atheist is like the person that sits down behind you and says, "Just get over it, just accept the reality." Both of those people we would consider them cruel, insensitive, almost inhumane, or inhuman even, individuals at a funeral. And so I don't find I'm making I'm pressing a very strong cultural critique here. I don't find anybody taking this event with its appropriate seriousness and care in terms of how people are undergoing it. Maybe, right, maybe they, maybe people will come back after properly grieving to their God. That happens. C.S. Lewis wrote about it in A Grief Observed. But he had to go through the grief, and he talked about it. He said it felt like there was a great big door in heaven that shut closed, and he was just cut off, right? And to just sit down beside him and say, just believe, or equally, just stop believing, is to miss the point, is to miss the process. And so I just want to, that critique is my way of separating off the sort of ideological combative thing that is not helpful, and trying to get us to really directly focus on what do we need to do in order to heal, in order to grow, in order to sound the depths of grief so we can sound the depths of reality. That's the question I'm asking. Now, right, and there's always, and that's the thing, remember we talked about when you grieve, you lose the world, and when you lose someone, you lose their world. Well, even more so with God, right? And there's a particularity, right? Grief is always particular to the being. Perhaps God shouldn't be thought of as a being, but anyways, the being that has been lost. And so, like, when you, like, every time you lose, like, it's been my experience, every time I lose a romantic relationship, yes, it's grief every time, but it's a different grief every time. It's like the same piece of music played on different musical instruments every time. There's a different tenor, all right, different tempo, right? And there's a particularity that has to be addressed or you do not properly grieve. Sorry, that was a bit of a speech, but I really wanted to make clear what I think we should be focusing on.
I'm what I want to do is maybe just sort of dance with it for a little while.
Yeah, please.
And allow things to come up. So one thing that came up for me was, it's funny. So with regard in regard to the new atheists,
Right.
And they kind of hit the scene when I was an adolescent, more or less.
Right.
But I even recall as an adolescent having a feeling that the new atheism had a very adolescent feeling to it. I felt like an angry teenager.
You're right.
Still feels like an angry teenager. But and then as you were talking, I was really starting, okay, what are ways that this experience, like how can I relate to the experience of the death of God in different ways? Maybe more embodied ways. And one had to do with the precise experience of adolescence, which is to say the child's relationship with the parent is the death of God.
Right.
As you move from child to adolescent, the essence of adolescence is precisely the loss of childhood, right? The breaking of and think about that from like a developmental perspective, from a mythopoetic perspective, like the notion of living in a mythic world, living in a world that is alive with fairies, in a world that's alive with magical potential, which is the childlike experience, and the aliveness, like the richness, the hue and color and tense, and the horror is all the more horrible and joy is all the more joyful, right? I mean, to yearn to return to childhood is a perfectly valid yearning because it's so singular and powerful. And in that context, of course, in childhood, we also have the relationship with the parent, with the mother, with the father, and even if you haven't had a very good childhood, there's at least some point where there's an experience of that as being an experience of connectedness. I suppose in some cases that's never true, and that's horrible to imagine, but that's the break. That's the fracture. And then you go through adolescence. And I love the idea right now of just playing with the metaphor of the adolescent precisely has not yet integrated the death of childhood, has not yet integrated the fracturing of the image of God embodied in the parent, embodied in the relationship, those relationships. And that the act of maturity, the act of transforming from adolescent into adult, is in fact to have gone through the true processing, the true grieving experience, which may take months or years or decades, depending on how close you are to being in late 20th century adolescent.
Right.
And then you become an adult, right? And then to be an adult is in fact to have come into a place where you are at peace with, really truly at peace with the developmental process in its most full sense. Like to be an adult is to be able to sit with the reality that childhood is a thing, that childhood comes and goes, that you will die, that everyone you love will die. Like that's to really
Yeah.
sit with an adult is to have like right relationship with the reality of reality and
Right.
to be able to say yes to it. So now we're coming back to Nietzsche, right? The yea
Yeah.
saying spirit, the
Yeah.
ability to have grieved the death of God is to be able to re-enter into a yea saying relationship with life itself.
That's well said.
All right. That's what came out of that little upwelling.
So, I mean, there's a couple, yeah, that's really good. First of all, I can't remember, was it, I'm trying to remember, I was just reading it this morning. Graham Harman was in his book on object-oriented ontology. He cites somebody, can't remember, and they argued that the predominant age group, like the adolescence is the predominant age model of our culture right now. Our culture venerates adolescence and looks at everything through an adolescent lens, and of course that is very problematic for lots of reasons. So let's play on that a little bit. And second, you talked about losing the image, and you mean in the imaginal sense. You mean in the inactive transjective, not images in your mind, right? And I think there of another C.S. Lewis book, The Discarded Image, one of his last books, how he talked about, we had this whole image of reality in which God figured, and that image has been discarded. We have thrown it away. And so again, what does that, I want to unpack what that means to throw that kind of encompassing image away. And then the other thing that came up for me was the degree to which we're talking about a virtue. It's the virtue that is most, well, perhaps the most important virtue, not singular, but one of the most important virtues with respect to adolescence. And then we have to use it carefully here without sounding condescending or anything like that. But we're talking about maturity here. I mean, the virtuous development is maturation. That's a thesis I'm going to propose. And maturity is a virtue. We praise it in people. It is an act of, you can condemn or criticize somebody by saying that they're being immature. And of course, maturation is a multidimensional thing. There's cognitive maturation, there's emotional maturity, there's existential maturity, and I think it's appropriate perhaps to talk about spiritual maturity. And so what I'm just throwing 3 balls in the air that came from what you said. You gave this sort of wonderful metaphor, really rich. We've got adolescence, and it's, I would argue, inappropriate prominence as the dominant age group of our culture. We have the difficulty now we have in talking about maturity, which might prevent us from properly grieving and moving on. And then we have to do with, there was a discarded image, and the adolescent discards an image. The West has discarded an image that was that's the discarded image, and perfectly apropos. And what does it mean? What does it mean, trying to use your analogy? What does the adolescent recover, if they do recover? And how does that connect to the maturation? And how does the adolescent come back to their parents? Right? So all of that, because like we need to know, okay, what is it to grieve? What is it to go through a loss? What do you have to do? What do you have to do? Like, and you often bring me down to that groundedness. Like, what do you have to do? Because we talked a lot about what grief means in connection to the sacred, but I like, what do you have to do? Like, what are the things you do? Like, in respect to the discarded image, the realization that like in adolescence, you're in a liminal state and that you need some kind of maturation that you don't yet have. What does that virtue look like? So that's a lot, but I'm trying to, do what you're doing. I'm trying to dance and give you some material back to work with.
Yeah, well, what I would say is what keeps coming up is the notion of heartbreak.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, so let's see. To be mature is to be able to be, God, it's so funny to be saying these words, but I think we can do a good job of allowing the words to be said and then expanding on them so that they're.
For sure. Let's trust each other on that.
So to be mature is to be able to stay in relationship with what is happening, with relationships, with experience, with life, while maintaining an open heart.
Right.
And so what I want to do is I want to open the notion of open heart so it's more
Right.
meaningful.
Right.
Um, and of course, what that means is that you will have heartbreak.
Yep. Yep.
If you close your heart, one of the reason why you close your heart, the reason why you close down your willingness to experience things, is because you want to avoid heartbreak. You
Yep.
want to avoid
Yep.
the pain of grief.
Yes.
And hold on, let me see. Okay, so let me give it an example. You mentioned how does the adolescent return to his, in this case, parents,
Right.
and having kids is a big part of it.
Yep. Yep.
I have
Yeah.
an 18-year-old daughter, and she's just getting ready to graduate, so going off into that next stage of life. And I was just remembering that when I was that age, when I went away to college, my continuity of relationship with my own parents was very poor.
Right.
There was no internet. There was no Zoom calls. I drove home, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 times a year.
Right.
I
Right.
called home probably less.
Yeah.
I almost never call anybody, so I never called home. And that continued. I graduated from college. I went to law school. I got married. I moved to another place. And so the number of times that I was in relationship with my parents from the moment that I graduated from high school was, fingers and toes.
Right. Right.
Small number. And frankly, most of the time they had to take the effort.
Right. Right. Right.
And then I was just sitting there with my daughter, who, as a parent, I love the way a parent does,
Right.
the way that, sacrificing yourself on the altar of parenting provides a level of connectedness to the sacredness of another human.
Yep. For
And I
sure.
was like, oh my God, like she has a lot of me, which is to say, she's very bad at maintaining contact.
Right.
If
Right.
I don't reach out to her, she rarely reaches out to me. And I just had this grief, heartbreak of imagining, years and decades going by and only like seeing her like these little flashes
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and the contact of who she is and who I am and our relationship fading. And that's heartbreak, right? But that heartbreak then creates an empathy going the other direction. I'm like empathizing with my own parents' experience of my being that, and then heartbreak again of being, oh my God, what a tragedy of my own failing, of
Right.
not being able to honor the beauty of that relationship and the care and love that they give and want to give, and basically even just be able to know these people, these most singular people, to truly know who they are as an adult, right? Because of course,
Right.
your child relationship with the parent is X, whatever it is. An adolescent relationship with the parent is Y, different, not a whole lot better.
Yeah.
But the question is like, who are they really? Like, as you become capable of being
Yeah.
in relationship with anybody, can you actually be in relationship with those people who are like you in deep sense, like you carry that lineage, like you
Yeah.
carry
Yeah.
the essence of their soul, and they're going to die, right? At which point
Yeah.
the ability to do that goes away. Like just to feel the reality of that all the way down and to feel it from both sides, like feel your own, your own children, your own child, and the possibility of the separation of that, and then mirror it back up. The agony of that is very powerful.
Right.
And that's one thing that came up, was just that feeling. Okay, so what was the next? Oh, well, let me just throw this out. This is just kind of frankly a fun one. But let's not let us not forget that the long arc of the baby boomers
Right.
has been a ruthless grasping onto adolescence.
Yes. Yes.
As a generation, probably as far as we know historically, the singular most committed to adolescence of any that's
Yes.
ever lived.
Yeah.
And our entire and holding our entire culture in that mode in every way.
I belong to the generation just after them, and it was like following a swarm of locusts, where by the time I had got there, they had consumed what was available and moved on. So we don't have new textbooks in the high school anymore. They're all 10 years, 20 years old, right? All that
And the
kind
high
of
schools are kind of tawdry and a little bit worn down.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the beaches have rules that you can't do the things you used to be able to do. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. And by the way, pop culture,
Yeah. Yeah.
shifts and degrades and follows their proclivities and their profanities that we got exposed to as young people. So just to put that out there, that there's a not just a sort of one directionality on this notion of a prolonged adolescence, but there's a particularity to it. I think that's
Yeah.
real. Like there's a
Historical fiction.
maturity,
Yeah. Yeah.
specific maturity that's being asked for. And it's even, by the way, it's even interesting, like their own parents, which in this case would be the GI generation, and the way that they ended life, like the invention of the retirement home
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the moving of death out of
Out of, yeah.
relationality,
Yeah.
all of that.
A loss of eldership. Right. Yeah, very much.
Yeah. So kind of stepping back and looping all the way back to the beginning, the like the true, like the deep acknowledgement, the deep recognition of the unspeakable tragedy of life.
Yeah.
Like the reality that if you're going to be open to experiencing life fully, you're going to be setting yourself up for a world of pain.
Right.
And that's just life. Like literally, if you love someone, you're now going to experience unbelievable grief. That's just what's going to happen.
Yes.
And to be entering into a way to, again, to say yes to that, to be able to really, really, really say yes to reality, which is just like the funny thing, to say
Yeah.
yes to life as it is, as the nature of reality has these characteristics to it, and to be able to sort of, and not suffer in the Buddhist, in the sense that Buddha didn't like,
Right. Right. Right.
but in the sense of to simply undergo, right? To
Yes.
just live life, but live life with an orientation towards yes, toward an orientation towards like yes, and like I will continue to love. I will not shirk away from love, even though I know experientially, with no avoiding it, that to love is also to grieve instantaneously. Like the act of one is the act of the other.
Yeah.
At the minimum, either your beloved or you are going to die. And
Yeah.
the experience, the acknowledgement of that is the severing of that. And the severing of that is going to be the experience of the grief.
Yeah.
And so in some really interesting sense, we might say that the death of God is actually a beautiful offering, like a gift of an opportunity to be able to grow into the maturity, to be able to say yes to the grief that comes from every other form of death that shows up in life.
That's beautiful. Bonhoeffer argued something like that about how Christianity needed to grow up, and he's writing that from within the Nazi prisons, and they're going to kill him. So he has every right to talk about facing reality. So that idea that you're getting this affordance to confront the depth of loss. So hold on to that. And then you had this other insight that really struck me, which is, and we talked about this last time, but you really did something really cool with it that might apply. You said, like, when I'm in this grief, what it does is it gives me an empathetic insight into my daughter forward, and it gives me an empathetic insight backwards to my parents. So this bi-directional insight, empathetic insight. And I was sort of juggling in my mind while also trying to keep in contact with you. It's like, well, what would be the analog? Like, are we like as our God is dying, does that give us the capacity to what are the like, there's like, do we more appropriately appreciate the ancestry that gave us that gift, and then do we try to see what in us is emerging, and what are we giving birth to, and how to so because our identity stretch both ways, and it's like, how does this heartbreak, how does it connect me? How does it allow me to more compassionately understand my spiritual ancestry? I'm struggling for terms here. And how does it help me to appropriately understand and afford my spiritual descendants? That what I thought that was a really great insight.
Yeah, I was seeing that notion of lineage in both directions, and in a
Yeah.
very great, like over vast timescales.
Yeah. Yes.
And what comes into the middle of that that emerges out of it is something like care,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
and something like responsibility, which I think are very closely related. And it's something like, as you, to the degree to which this to properly grieve the death of God, right? To the degree
Yeah.
to which you enter into that grief honestly, and you, and then of course you actually feel it.
Yes.
There is an opening into this empathic connection
Right.
bidirectionally,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
which also opens up into the, oh yeah, wow. I'm pretty sure we're actually recapitulating some pretty, like, there's theology that has come here before. I remember seeing the image of the cross and what that means, but
Yeah.
of entering into proper care for that which lives and dies, right? That the
Right.
proper
Right.
care for the
Yeah.
aspect of reality that we are part of, which is the aspect of reality that's precisely that which is finite in nature.
Right. Right.
Um, and so the opening up into and allowing oneself to be empowered by the death of God,
Right.
perhaps, is the gateway to a true connection, an empathic connection that has the sources and like orients or guides the right relationship, the relationships of care, the relationships of responsibility, both for all that has come, in this
Right.
case, parent and back,
Yeah.
and in response to or in service of all that will come. And again, of course, you have now the child and the grandchild and go forward. It's really nice that it's not just theoretical. You've got the very practical. You got your
Sure.
actual parent and your actual child, and then you've got the notion of lineage. But
Yes.
you have
Yeah.
that notion of like, how do you sit? Like, how do you sit in the middle of where you are, the moment that you're in right now? And now we're back to the notion of the sacred, right?
Yes.
To be
Yeah.
able to enter into the relationships of care with the right, like, right orientation, the right discernment, and the notions of responsibility is how you are able to be in relationship with reality, with the world as sacred.
It sounds to me like you're saying something else. Um, that that ability through the death of God to come into this stereoscopic awareness of lineage and take up one's care of it is precisely the virtue of maturity,
Yes, that's
right?
precisely it.
That's precisely what the virtue of maturity is. And so, I mean, what's being afforded then is
Mm.
a way. I mean, we should be trying as much as we can then to deeply appreciate all of these transitions, because every time there's been a spiritual transition, the upper Paleolithic transition, the agrarian revolution, the axial age, people were going through the death of God and something else, right, was emerging.
Yeah.
There's a long history of these, and we can more appropriately, like, we could we could see our ancestry better, and then we can see we can maybe it would give us maybe the aspect of looking forward is a bit of discernment. Can we look forward to our the forward part of the, I'll call it the spiritual descendants. I hope that doesn't sound pretentious, right? But can we discern between what, right, is coming after us that is like us but is going to be beyond us, like the way your daughter is like you but beyond you, right? That we have that empathetic connection to. Can we discern a difference between that and the thing we were talking about earlier? People who are stuck, people who, right, cannot um, enter into that proper reverential care for the lineage that I think we're arguing constitutes spiritual maturity.
Yeah. Did you and I talk about the quote, well-behaved women rarely make history?
No, no, I
Okay, so
don't.
that was in another conversation. Let's do it here because I think it lands very nicely.
Right,
So there's that quote. I think it's Margaret Mead.
right,
And I had the insight recently, like just in the past 2 weeks, of, oh my gosh, my understanding of that has always been exactly the inverse of what I think is the proper understanding.
Right.
My initial sort of superficial understanding was, and therefore women should behave badly so that they can make history.
Right. Right. Right.
But if I actually think about it deeply, what I realize is that, oh, bad behavior, the kind of behavior that makes history, is in fact fundamentally wrong.
Right.
And that well-behaved women were doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And it's the model of that is the model that we should be seeking towards.
Right. Right.
So stuckedness. Well,
Yeah.
what does it mean to endeavor to make history?
Right.
What does it mean? So you know the poem Ozymandias,
Right. By Shelley.
right?
Yes, very much.
There's two things that happen. One is that you strive egoically, right?
Yeah.
The part of you that doesn't want to pass away, the part of you
Yes.
that wants to last forever,
Her. Yes.
strives to carve itself deeply into some
Yeah.
civilization, to be
Yeah.
remembered beyond your death, right? To be
Yeah.
storied in history.
Yeah.
Um, and that's only useful to the degree to which the civilization you carve into itself carries that same intent. So it carves itself into humanity forever.
Yeah. It tries
So
to.
you have to have, it has to have that as intent, right?
Yep. Very much.
To ensure, to guarantee, to require that the future exists really only so much as it carries you forward with it. And it's
Yes.
like
It's
the
imprisoning the future in a powerful way.
yes, it's imprisoning the future in a very powerful way, in a truly kind of demonic way, really.
Well, that's what comes out in the poem.
Yes, exactly. The poem is like, I remember reading that poem and going, whoa, that's it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
nailed it.
Yeah.
Observe all of my great works, ye mighty, and despair. You know, like,
And the lone and level sands. What is it? The lone and level sands or bare sands stretch far, far away. Yeah. Right. Just. Oh, I got a similar experience. Just to interject. Um, I don't think this is a particularly good movie, but I was watching the Titanic, and there was two scenes that I thought Cameron got that were for me the whole movie. So there's a scene where they sort of do a cutaway, and you see the back of the Titanic, and it is this, well, it is a Titanic machine. It is this vast ship, and you go all these levels, and man working in these huge machines. Oh, how vast the Titanic is! And then forward to the scene, which is the night before, like the dusk, where the two main characters are standing on the bow of the Titanic, and it's just before it's going to sink. And he does a helicopter camera shot, and he pulls away, and the Titanic is minuscule against the ocean. And you went, and I remember going, "Oh yeah, right." The Titanic is really big, but it's nothing compared to the ocean. And I
yeah,
remember getting that sense. I got that same sense when I read Ozymandias by Shelley. It's like, yes, you've made this a huge statue that's going to carve, like you said, your name for all of eternity, and it's being swallowed up by this desert that just overwhelms it. Overwhelms it.
as it always will be.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And so they say, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, what does it mean to have the kind of almost the inverse intent?
Yeah.
What does it mean to have an intent where you choose to live your life deeply, deeply acknowledging that your name will be remembered only by those who you loved and connected with most closely,
Yep.
and will fade very quickly. Like
Yep.
within a couple of generations, your name will return to the dust.
Yes.
But your care is an authentic, true care for the ongoingness of the thing that is most close, like for the thing that is the most
Yeah.
sacred. So you are just a part of that. And to the degree to which the life itself or livingness or whatever it is, like that thing, that vital essence continues to move forward in the world in the way that it needs to, in the way that each child is truly free to choose how they are going to be and who they're going to grow into, and then enters into the same dynamic of separating from the
Oh,
past, going
oh,
through a process, entering into maturity, and then re-swearing themselves, reorienting themselves to an oath to yay saying back into life, and thus it continues, something like that.
that's beautiful. It made me think of when I was raising my stepson, and he was going through very difficult adolescence, and he had been very he was the divine child. The way he was brought up uh, by his mother, and he's a wonderful person now. So I don't want to besmirch him in any ways, but I remember saying to him at one point, and then I'm going to make a point on this. I remember saying to him, I was saying, look, you don't get this. The point isn't about you being cool, because cool is adolescent fame. That's what cool means. Cool. There's no cool is completely indexical. What's cool shifts around. What it refers to is adolescent fame. It's being famous among the adolescents. That's what coolness is, right? And I said, it's not about being cool. You have to make yourself valuable to other people if you want to be an adult, right? And notice what you're saying. So I'm hearing what happens is the childhood image that needs to be discarded is, how do things matter to me? And how can I make the universe, Ozymandias, how can I make the universe continue to point to me and matter to me? And the whole shift you have to make is you have to go, no, no, no. Once I discard childhood is, how can I matter to something beyond me? Right? How can I, like we've talked about this, be in service to what has preceded me and what will follow me? And that reminds me then of the core of agapic love, because the core of agapic love is to realize that your ancestry is agape and your future, right? Your descendants are through your agape.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about that in the context of just, being a parent, and particularly a parent of like a young child.
Yes.
I'm actually thinking about it in terms of my wife, so being a mother of a young child, where you're to be a good parent, as I think we both know and agree, is first and foremost to be and have that open heart.
Yes.
To come always from a basis of love.
Yeah.
And we may need to be careful to sort of disambiguate that from what would you call it, like treating people nicely, or whatever you want to call it, like indulgence. That's not the same thing, right? Love is a crucible. There's a hot thing. Love melts things.
Yeah.
But as a mother, the necessity for that, to be able to actually commit to that and actually deliver on it, is to go through heartbreak continuously.
Yeah.
Your child will break your heart moment to moment to moment. And to be able just like to be with that, and actually just kind of be so overfilled with love that your heartbreak itself doesn't pull you even an iota off of that, so that you can actually just return back and return back. It's that you actually, in this case, become Christ on the cross. You become the God that sacrifices itself, himself, herself, in order to continue to be able to return, right? The sacrifice is to be able to return. You allow your heart to break so that you can come back from that place of the deeper love to bring it back into service.
Right. And that taps into, again, how the heartbreak, the grief, takes us to the depths of our heart so we can reach into the depths of another person. So I'm starting to see some things drawing together here. A logos is taking shape between agape, right? The bidirectional empathetic connection, the reverence for that lineage, the willingness to matter to it rather than have it matter to you. Like, all of these things are now sort of, in my mind, coalescing together. They're starting to, I feel like we're getting close to what it would be to become unstuck, what it would mean to reorient.
Yeah. I can say that as a recovering adolescent, I'm even noticing that as I'm speaking, part of me is pulling back. I'm like, fuck that, man. That sounds hard. And it's so funny. Like I even noticed over the past 4 or 5 years, every single time that something has gone, a relationship has moved in a place where I feel regret, it has always been an adolescent response to the event that has been at the core of it in me.
I'm going through something like that right now, where I'm trying to take responsibility and emphasize empathetic connection outwards and how I'm mattering to others, rather than the adolescent thing, which is the thing about adolescents. I mean, I because I've raised several of them, is they want the privileges of an adult and they want the security of a child, right? And they vacillate between it. And I think vacillation, that kind of vacillation, is precisely what we're seeing in our culture, right? Where we around the sacred, we want to be able to speak as if we don't have to go through any growth or transformation. We can just speak the sacred. We want full maturity privileges with respect to the adulthood of sacredness, as if we can just pronounce on these things, whereas other people had to go through decades long processes before they felt they were responsible enough to carefully speak about the sacred. So we have people who, I can just talk about God and blah blah on that, and then we have other people who want, no, I just want to be loved and adored by God. I just want the universe to be a place that is constantly caring for me. And I feel our culture vacillating back and forth. And again, similar to that place of adolescence, and the way the adolescent gets stuck is the Peter Pan syndrome, right? The Peter Pan syndrome is, I want to keep all of this wonderful future open by never committing myself. And that way I don't actually lose, right? I don't actually lose all the magic of childhood. And of course, Peter Pan loses his shadow, and we know what that means, even in Jungian terms, right? He can't, he's stuck in never land because he will never grow up, right? And so I see our culture precisely because it vacillates with with respect. I'm picking up on you there. One of the ways in which the adolescence towards the sacred is expressing itself is in this vacillation that keeps us stuck forever in never.
Let me throw another brand on the fire.
Yeah.
So this is the newest version of VR rig.
Right.
And my expert opinion tells me that this is now placing us at the nub of the curve in VR.
Right.
It's where this is the generation before the generation. And so this is something that will achieve enough adoption, enough use, that the next generation that comes out will begin to become ubiquitous. Okay.
Right. Oh, that's so dangerous.
So adolescent.
Yeah.
Adolescent wants the power of the adult and the responsibility of the child.
Yes, exactly.
Well, that is if there's nothing, one of the things that happened, one of the reasons why we killed God was to unlock our capacity to do that.
Yes.
Our adolescent rebellion, and by here I mean we, was the West in about 500 years ago, was to pursue, and with an unseeming recklessness, power, without equal responsibility.
I think that's well said. Yeah.
And there's a whole story about that. We can talk about what the game theoretic implications are of what happens if you don't choose that path.
Yep.
And how there's an obligation, in fact, to choose that path if you want to actually be at all in the context of what I call game A.
Right.
But the point here is that this, and I've made this argument many times, but now we're getting pretty close to the end. Is just think about the implications of cell phones and social media. The last big wave of power, absent adequate responsibility.
Well said.
May have already killed us, right? We may actually already be dead. Like our addiction, the addictive power of social media and mobile technology, in the consequence of, what does Tristan Harris call it? Like mind one or something like that. Like our own capacity to maintain our health and fight off the dopamine, serotonin, attention jacking systems that we are in relationship with the previous generation of technology is possibly inadequate, and therefore it's already done deal. Like we're done. The last human will die staring intently at their cell phone. But even if that's not true, it will be true of this. A true immersive VR environment, particularly with our spookily matrix-like Neuralink Elon Musk work, right? Which would be the fully mature version of that. If we do not enter into that degree of power with a symmetric degree of responsibility, the technical term for that is we are fucked. Right? And we are not far from that. Right. So now what I'm doing is that I'm bringing in the energy of this notion of grieving the death of God. This notion of entering into a level of maturity, this notion of using that grief to actually generate the capacity in ourselves and in our population as a group to achieve a level of care for the sacred, which in this case is going to be just, for example, our kids and other people's kids, is strictly necessary to engender the capacity to choose to have the responsibility equal to the power that is literally right in front of us. Right? And I assure you that Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, which is the company that produces this, won't slow down on their own.
No. So that's a beautiful connection. Thank you for that. it strikes me that what you're saying is that technology will make stilted, stuck adolescence even more addictive for us. And it will also partially get that kind of access to our core self because of the way it can be a surrogacy for God and the way it can take the place, like you said, of a relationship to reality. Um,
Virtual reality. It's
yeah,
literally called that.
as opposed to the reality of virtue, which is what you and I
Yes.
have been talking about.
Yeah. Nice.
So yeah, that's a very good connection. So grief, I mean, what that does is that lends a degree of urgency to, we need to properly grieve the death of God. I mean, the Enlightenment deal was precisely a severing, right? The pursuit, it was the Ozymandias pursuit of power that no longer felt it bore any responsibility to the parental world that had given birth to it. That the Enlightenment saw itself as, burn, like Voltaire said, committed to the flames, right? Burning the past in order
Yeah.
to make the utopic future, which is also not a proper relationship to the future, because the utopic future, you and I have talked about it, is not that it is to imprison the future. It is to not allow the future to be other than you. It is to try and inscribe yourself into the future perpetually. So I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think that 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 piece of technology you held up is is hyper modern, to throw another new modernism onto, right, in the way in which it's taking that the destruction of our care for lineage and just accelerating it, and then entombing us in a surrogacy that will prevent us from properly grieving, so that we can identify with our parents and our kids and
Mhm.
disappear into the lineage that we participate in. I think that's what I'm hearing you say.
That is what I'm saying. Very much so. And by the way, I'm not saying that there is no role.
No.
I put this in this. I put this in the category of psychotechnology.
Yeah,
I put
exactly.
it in the category of like LSD and ayahuasca and
Yeah,
cannabis and
yeah,
dancing at the firelight and staring at the stars and things like that. Which is to say that if we are able to enter into a shamanic relationship, or it's funny, when I was talking about this with Zach Stein earlier, I found myself, for whatever reason, the aesthetic was actually a medieval Islamic aesthetic,
yeah, yeah.
and the relationship of care for, in particular, because the Quran includes stories about the jinn.
Yes, yeah,
And so
yeah,
for Islam, the notion of the sort of supernatural realms where there's demons and
yeah,
jinn and all kinds of things, and there's stories about how as an alchemist, right, which is an Arabic word, as an alchemist, as you are in relationship with those kinds of worlds,
right.
you got to be careful.
Yeah, yeah,
What do you do when a jinn asks your true name?
yeah,
How do you navigate the relationships of these other kinds of worlds? And that's that aesthetic is the aesthetic, that level of carefulness.
yeah,
By the way,
yeah,
also skillfulness, like
yeah,
deftness,
yeah.
is the aesthetic
Virtuosity.
that is appropriate for dealing with this, which is precisely the same kind of thing.
Yeah,
Both at the individual level, how do I enter into a relationship with that so that I am taking the level of care and responsibility that is necessary to maintain the integrity of my own soul in this relationship with the virtual? But then also as a creator, right? If I'm
right,
producing these kinds of things, I have a shamanic level of care for all the other people who will be using my particular
right,
psychotechnology, but will be putting their souls at risk in that relationship.
right, right.
Um, and I think these things are all very closely tied together. Like in some sense, what we're talking about is in the maybe the macro loop is it is most needful now in this moment to at long last awaken from the adolescence of our civilization
Yeah,
and to choose to step into maturity, which first and foremost means re-establish our right relationship with, if even just the notion of the sacred first.
yeah,
Right? Don't
yeah,
have an intrinsic allergic reaction to it, but actually, okay, say be curious about what's happening here and what's that mean and what does it look like, and then begin to actually step into it, which is going to require, and this is, I guess, the key idea, is going to require a true journey of heartbreak, a true journey of
Yeah.
truly reopening yourself from all of the addictions and all of the numbingness and all of the distractions that have separated you from life, which, by the way, is itself the most tragic thing. You know, I remember having the realization, the true deep realization of the portion of my life that was wasted watching stupid television in the 80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Instead of
No,
having meaningful relationships with family and friends, just tuning into this fucking TV, which was a
yeah.
super salient mind jacking, limbic system jacking
Yeah.
parasite that did nothing for me other than overcode me with false metaphors and weird tropes. And by the way, some level of cool aesthetics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a tragedy, right? That's death. Like, that's precious life that was spent in the least meaningful way imaginable.
Mm.
In some sense, no better than just being a straightforward drug addict and just, you know,
Oh,
staring at
yeah.
at space. In fact, in some sense, almost identical.
Yeah.
So that's it, right? We have to like acknowledge in ourselves the degree to which we are all massive addicts to a super normal, super salient world, that has turned us away from life, from meaningfulness. Accept the reality of that. Like, oh my God, the heartbreak of how much life has been wasted and spent.
Yeah.
I'm an addict. I have in fact been profaning the sacred routinely, most
Yeah.
notably myself, and then
Yeah.
the people I love the most. And then rebuild habits of being actually able to steer ourselves through this super normal world that we've created for ourselves, without constantly distracting ourselves from the hard stuff that our heart wants to avoid, so that it doesn't have to endure heartbreak, but rebuild the capacity to truly grieve and understand the energy, the fundamentally sacred potency of grief as the orienting basis towards a higher empathy that allows you to enter into true relationships of care.
That was beautifully said, Jordan. I thought that was a great summative statement. I thought that was excellent. Well done. That was really good. That was really good.
I'm glad. All right. Now I'm going to go back to playing video games and avoiding life.
Okay. Thank you very
Oh, it's a tough gig.
Yeah, yeah. This was very good, and I like the way. I'm happy with the way we took care of the proposal, because I thought it weaved the other two, part one and part two, together very nicely. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I look forward to finding out other kinds of games we can play together.
Yeah, me too. Okay,
All right,
I
man.
think we